Welcome on this wintry day in southwestern Michigan, December 4th, 2024. My name is Ed Derbin, and just wanted to walk through. There's actually quite a bit of material here I'm going to walk through. Just take our time. But I want to take a look at our current economic situation and kind of to give a basis for what's kind of I'm not going to say crystal ball because everyone talks about economists with their crystal balls, and I don't have one. But I'm just looking at trying to look at our current situation and provide a little bit of analysis based upon that. So in particular, we're looking again. These are macro, big picture type things that we're focusing on. Looking at the economy in terms of economic growth, the gross domestic product, price level changes, inflation. We haven't seen much deflation, or we haven't seen it in quite a while at any rate, and also employment or unemployment. Also, I wanted to talk a bit about interest rates. This is something that, of course, everyone is interested in interest rates, right? And to dig into it a little bit in detail on how that interest rates are, how they're kind of arrived at, because there's so many, but just a kind of a general overview look-see at it. And lastly, a bit on, it's become a big topic of late, talking about tariffs and the implication of tariffs and so on and so forth. That's actually part of a broader picture, if you will, of trade, and we'll talk a bit about that as well at the very end of this presentation. So just kind of bear with me, and we'll get through this. Thank you. So first up, we're going to be talking about economic growth. Typically, we refer to as we target GDP, gross domestic product. At any rate, in general, the rule of thumb, if you will, for reasonable GDP growth should be at about 3%. That's considered to be about average, or has been considered to be about average in the past. And in the past, I mean going back, probably the last 50, 60 years or so. At any rate, so from the 25-year period from 1983 to 2007, the average the real GDP growth rate was at 3.4%. So that was pretty good. There were a lot of ups and downs in that time, and I'm blocking out the recession that leading up to that. But the point again is that 3% is a pretty good number for average economic growth, and that's where it was at for about a 25-year period on average. Okay, so in the following 16 years, from 2008 through 2023, the average real GDP growth rate was only 1.9%. A lot of stuff has happened. Obviously, we've gone through 3 recessions in essence in that time. Yes, we've gone through 3 recessions in that time, but nonetheless, we really have not grown that much, and that is the key to the economic growth. You have to grow, and if we don't do that, then we do stagnate, and it causes significant problems, as we've realized there, we've experienced over the last several years, especially in terms of running deficits and so on and so forth. But we'll get into that in a bit later. Anyhow, so another thing to note is that a good portion of the economic growth over the period from 2015 through 2023 has been, again, this of course takes into account the COVID years as well, where government really stepped in quite a bit, averaged at about 17.6%, about 18%. It's not necessarily high, relatively speaking, as to what we saw in the past, but nonetheless, that's a significant part of our economy. Has to do with that, with the government sector. Whether it's not a matter of good, bad, but it's just a matter of it does have a major role to play in the economy, the government sector. And we'll be getting more into that in a bit. But anyhow, just wanted to walk through the economic growth piece of this first. So moving on to price level changes, or I guess in more more common parlance, it would be inflation or deflation, perhaps disinflation. But at any rate, we've experienced quite a bit of inflation, obviously. And if you can take a look at this chart, this is the personal consumption expenditures data index, rather, that's put together by the Bureau of Economic Analysis under the Department of Commerce. And we'll be talking a bit more about the more, I'm not going to say the more common, but the ones that are generally in the media more, would be the through the Bureau of Labor Statistics at any rate. So the PCE index, or the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, is what the Federal Reserve, in terms of their monetary policy authority, they turn to this Personal Consumption Expenditures Index quite a bit. So the good news is that inflation has come down from a peak of over 7% in June of 2022. The bad news is that that was the highest that we'd experienced since going back to 1981, when we had runaway inflation through the at various times in the 1970s, driven primarily by the energy crises that we experienced again in 1974, and then again in 1978, 79, in that time frame. So, but again, we have seen a considerable drop in that inflation. We call that disinflation. So we have continued inflation, but it has dropped. To October of 2024, it went to 2.3%, which was this is the concerning part. Most recently is that it did pop up from 2.1% in September up to 2.3% in October of 2024. So these are, it's not 1 month. There's not a trend to make, of course, but these are always things to be concerned with. That continued persistent amount of inflation that's out there. Anyhow, there's more to follow when we get into the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So again, sticking with this, with inflation, with these price level changes, the first part that we're looking at is what's called the PPI, or the Producer Price Index. So the Producer Price Index, this is what the producers, this is the firms, businesses, etc., pay for the productive resources from the household, meaning the labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land. Again, it could be goods and services, or it includes goods and services. So that would, of course, that would include the wages of the labor, et cetera, that would be flowing forth to the firm. So the good news was that it had, we actually saw some deflation for the month, if you will, for September 2024. But then we saw a bit of an uptick, 2.4% again in October of 2024, October, the following month of 2024. So this is concerning, of course, for a variety of reasons. One being that whenever it does tick up, it's whether we're talking about the PPI, the Producer Price Index, or the CPI, we kind of are waiting on like tenterhooks in terms of like what's going to follow. What does this signal something ahead? But again, at any rate, this is the PPI, and the interesting thing about the PPI, at least in the past, when I'm talking about the past, I'm looking, over the long stretch of 20, 30 years, especially going back further in that time frame, rather than within the last several years. What we've seen is that the PPI translates fairly quickly into the CPI. So remember, this is what the firms are paying for those goods and services flowing from the household, as opposed to the CPI, and those are the consumer prices. What we, as again, the household with the other hat on, as consumers, are paying for those goods and services. So the PPI typically translates or is carried forward into the CPI in a fairly quick manner. Again, at least that's the way it was in the past. Not quite so much within recent years. However, and the reason that it doesn't necessarily or does translate very quickly is all dependent upon competition within those firms, or between those firms, if you will, with the business on the business side. If there is significant competition, or in the presence of significant competition, it's difficult for firms to do what? To raise prices, which that's their fast way to offset their increased cost, is to try to pass them on as quickly as they can to the consumer. If they can't, due to competitive pressures, what they have to do is eat those costs. And when I say eat those costs, it doesn't stay at the firm. It flows back to the household as providers of those productive resources, driving down prices in the productive resource markets, or the resource markets. Again, labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land. At any rate, that's kind of a quick primer, overdid, but on to CPI next. So again, with CPI, this is a consumer price index, and this is again coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics under the Department of Labor. So with the CPI, what we have is these are the prices that the household as consumers are paying for those goods and services. And once again, we had a bit of an uptick from September 2024 to October 2024, from 2.4% up to 2.6%. And the other point I want to make, so this is again reason for some uncertainty out there, that hopefully we're not going to see this persist going forward. Anyhow, the point is that the real takeaway from this is that when we see those higher prices going back to, again, the high point being in 2022, post-COVID, and all the reasons that this came forward was primarily because of the helicoptered funds that were dumped by the federal government in terms of sending out payments, sending out COVID checks. There are various terms for it, but that kind of ginned up a lot of demand. It opened up the door for people to purchase more things, which makes sense. If you've got more money, there's a tendency to try to spend it somehow, some way. And in the absence of the supply, because of everything being shut down for COVID, that had a tendency to, yes, guess what, to drive prices up. At any rate, so the disconcerting thing about this, of course, is that we've all heard this, but the way the CPI, way these indexes work, is they're moving on previous data, meaning that it's continued. The price changes are based on that previous index amount. So even though we're experiencing what's called disinflation, the rate of inflation dropping, we still have that previous inflation embedded in those prices. And that's the part that is probably the one that troubles us the most, because what we've seen from just going back to January of 2020 was that in January 2020 through the current, we have an overall price increases of 22%, which it's quite a bit. It's previous, going prior to that, that cumulative inflation was significantly lower, as evidenced in this chart that we're looking at here too. But without going into much further detail, the reality is that we have prices that are significantly higher, and they've been sticky in terms of, we continue to have that inflation. It's at a lower rate, disinflation. Nonetheless, we continue to have that inflation. Ideally, going forward, we will hope to see some deflation. And I know that's a bad word for some people. They're thinking that that's a portent of recession and so on and so forth, but not necessarily. If it's driven by competitive forces, that's not a bad thing, especially for the consumer, correct? Anyway, we'll talk more about these things going forward, but that's enough for now so far as those price level changes are concerned. On to the next leg of the stool, the three-legged stool of macroeconomics, looking at, again, the big picture in our economy, the big movers. This last piece is employment or unemployment, however you want to characterize it. But at any rate, the unemployment rate, it's called the U3 unemployment rate in particular. It's the unemployed divided by the labor force. The labor force is equal to the employed plus the unemployed. This is, again, coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics under the Department of Labor. And they put together this is the so-called official unemployment rate, the U3 unemployment rate. This is the one that we hear about every month, and it'll be coming up this Friday. The first Friday of the month is when they publish this statistic through the current population survey. Now, also, there's another survey, but I won't go into that at this point. So we did have an uptick from September to October, and in the unemployment rate going from 2.4 up to 2.6. But this is just one part of the story. But again, without going into too much detail, if we look back prior to the COVID leap in unemployment, we still haven't driven back down to that previous level. We were at one point, but it's notched back up a bit. And much of that probably has to do with the Federal Reserve's monetary policy side driving up the Fed funds rate, which we will be getting into more going forward. But again, this is just kind of the surface layer, if you will, of the employment situation. We'll be talking much more about this going forward here. So now we're moving on to probably, this is something, the labor force participation rate. This is something that I've really focused on for quite a number of years, probably going back to the Great Recession, 2008 and onward, if you will. The labor force participation rate is, again, another statistic through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it has to do with those employment numbers. And basically what we're looking at is the labor force, the total employed plus the unemployed. So putting the two together counts for the labor force. So the employed plus those unemployed. The unemployed are those people that are not employed, obviously. They have to meet these two criteria. Not employed but actively seeking employment. Okay, so not employed but actively seeking employment. So that constitutes that labor force, the employed plus those unemployed, divided by what's called the non-institutional population. And the non-institutional population counts, if you look at the overall population in the U.S. of 335 million, I don't have the number directly in front of me. I'll get to that in a minute on the non-institutional population side, but it takes out people that are under the age of 16, for example. So the non-institutional population just covers those folks that are 16 years of age and over, if you will. And it also takes out the people that are institutionalized, and not necessarily in a bad way. That would include the military, folks in the military, yes, people that are in prison, that are also folks that are in nursing homes, et cetera, that are counted in some other institutions. So they're separated out from this non-institutional population. So that's the denominator, all right? So in October of 2024, the number had gone down. So going down is not a good thing, right? So there are fewer people that are kind of involved, if you will. There are fewer people in the labor force that are out there actively either employed or unemployed, but actively seeking employment. So it went down from 62.7 down to 62.6. And again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people here. So these small changes in these percentage rates equate to large numbers. At any rate, so one of the things, looking at this chart in particular, going back to this goes back to about to 2000. And the takeaway is that you'll notice that there was a decline in the labor force participation rate, which pretty much took off after the Great Recession, or part of the Great Recession in 2008. And moving forward, it continued to decline. So part of that is, remember now, the people that are not in the labor force, that NLF, as I refer to it, the not in the labor force component of the non-institutional population. I know those are a lot of words thrown at you, but the folks that are kind of part of that group that are not institutionalized but are over the age of 16, a good portion of them would be included the baby boomers. So it would include a lot of retirees, people that are, for whatever reason, are not working, right? So as baby boomers, and so the baby boom went from 1946 to 1964, at least in my book. Those numbers are they fluctuate a little bit, and all the other, Generation X, Z, and Y, and, so on and so forth, that kind of came after that. But that large group of people that constitute the shrinking, for obvious reasons, that constitute that baby boom has certainly impacted the number of people that are out there working, that are out there seeking work, right? Part of that labor force. Nonetheless, and I'm not going to get into any great detail here. The reality is that many of those people that are, again, age 60, we'll just say age 65 and over, which constitutes most of that baby boom era from 46 to 64, 1946 to 1964. Most of them are retired or outside of the labor force, but there are quite a few that are actually sticking around, and they're sticking around in at a much higher rate than they were in the past. Part of that has to do with needing the income, frankly, and part of it also has to do with the ability to continue working jobs perhaps that are not completely physical labor, digging ditches, etc. Anyway, there's a lot to the story, but the point again is that it's dropped precipitously and it's stayed at low rates. But also what's interesting, just looking at this chart over to the right, we see the pre-COVID numbers and we see the post-COVID numbers. We have not seen the numbers come back up to that even pre-COVID level that we had, again, prior to February of 2020. That's my stake in the sand, so to speak. And that's troubling in and of itself. Again, we're currently at about 62.6% labor force participation rate. And from 2000 to 2008, for example, again, with the baby boomers plugged in there, of course, we were averaging over 66%. I'm going to kind of make a leap of faith here, and we'll talk more about this, but I'll introduce it here. What I would like to put forth is that we should be at a significantly higher rate than the 62.6%. There are some reasons for it being down, down lower, or actually dropping, if you will, from September to October, but this overall number should be significantly higher. And I would contest that it could be 65%, or frankly, it should be at 66%. And we'll talk more about that going forward. But these are some things to just kind of set in your mind for the moment when we talk about this labor force participation rate. So with this slide, we're going to be kind of digging into some of the detail on this, and it's kind of wonky, but just kind of bear with me. I'll try to keep it at a fairly high level. So just starting with, we're looking at the actual numbers that were put out there by in the current population survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So let's start with the big number, if you will, taking away from that, moving down from that overall U.S. population of about 335 million. We take out the under 16 years of age and those folks that are otherwise institutionalized. It gets us down to about that 269 million mark. And beneath that, or up, building up to that, would be the not in the labor force component, and then the labor force component. So we take out that not in the labor force component, those retirees and people that are on the sidelines for a variety of reasons, staying home watching kids, etc. Lots and lots of reasons, but these are people that are outside of that. So we're looking at a population of about 100 million that are on the sidelines, right? And the folks that are kind of rowing the boat, so to speak, the folks that are at the oars would be the labor force, and more specifically the employed portion of it. And the unemployed are champing at the bit, trying to get at the oars to do what to help pull on those oars a bit. So we're looking at about 7 million people that are part of the unemployed, and that drives us back to that unemployment rate. I think it was about at 2.6% at any rate. So that labor force participation rate again is that labor force, which is the employed plus the unemployed, divided by the civilian non-institutional population. That drives us down to that 62.6%. So as I was stating before, this number should be significantly higher. And let me just posit it this way. Why I say that is that if we have, being at that 62.6%, a lot of those boomers, if you will, I know that's a pejorative term for some, but for me it just doesn't matter. But I've heard it all my life, but it's kind of funny that it's become, again, somewhat of a negative. There's some negative connotations with it, and I guess I understand that. You got to blame someone, right? So with the boomers moving out of this labor force, you would expect, or you would need to have someone backfilling those positions. So what I'm putting forth is that we should not be having this 62% labor force participation rate. It should be significantly higher. It should be 65%. With those jobs that have to be backfilled. And you can argue, well, then maybe these jobs were feather bedding jobs in terms of like once the person's gone, then the job goes away. Yeah, there's some degree that would be the case, due to efficiencies and that the dreaded artificial intelligence words come up. But all that aside, you still have to have people fill some of those positions at the very least. And frankly, there are, and this is anecdotal, and this is not, in my backyard, and you have to be careful with this, but from people that I've spoken to that are actually hiring people, it's a tough, they're having quite a tough time. Part of it has to do with mismatch of, the employment skills, but even more has to do with, especially the jobs that are not as skilled, has to do with just not being able to find people to fill those positions. Why that is the case, we could talk about that, but we'll say that for another time. Point again being is that there are a lot of people on the sidelines that really should be in the workforce, and this is my contention is that if we adjusted, again, walking through this process, if we adjusted this labor force up to that 65% even, so pushing it up to 65%, so we take the 65% of that civilian non-institutional population of the 269 million, that drives us up to 175 million, if you will, for the labor force, that adjusted labor force, okay? So obviously, the employed number stays the same at 161 million, 161.5 million, we'll just say. So if we making that adjustment, we just say, okay, 175 million less the 161.5 million gets us to that adjusted, and I'm air quotes here, adjusted unemployment rate, unemployed number of 13.5 million as opposed to the 7 million that are counted currently as actual unemployed. So the difference between those two gets us to about 6.6 million. So what I'm saying is that there are at least 6.6 million people on the sidelines, and this is an extremely conservative number. I feel very comfortable in saying that number is much closer to 10 million, and I've heard people say that it's, some economists, some wonky people have kind of put that number at at a significantly higher number, up to as much as 12 million people that are on the sidelines that really, really ought to be working. There are reasons why they're not working. Some are not a desire to work. Others, the reservation price, meaning that the cost, if you will, of going out there and working is too much. Meaning if you're getting something that equates to, $13, $15 an hour in terms of some benefits being accrued to you, in the form of healthcare, some other type of benefits, it's a tough sell to try to get someone to get back into the workforce at that $15 an hour, where they have to surrender their 40 hours a week in order to, or some amount that, to offset those other benefits that again are being accrued to them. Anyway, we could get into great detail on that, but let's leave it at that. And the point is that with the adjusting for that, for this extra 6.5 million people, 6.6 million people, that would push up that U3 unemployment rate, double it basically, getting it up to quite a bit higher, 8%. I think I was incorrect in the number I said before, the percentage, but it would push it up significantly higher. We'll just leave it at that, okay? So this is just something, again, that I've been looking at, been paying very, very close attention to. I'm not alone, but it's something that I've been looking at for a number of years. So I tend to kind of ignore that U3 unemployment rate, and I focus more on the labor force participation rate because and I know this is where we are in actuality and where we ought to be type of a situation, but it causes me, it gives me pause and makes me think, so how do we make this happen? How do we get these people back into the workforce? How do we get these people back out there looking for employment and connecting those people those employers that are in need of people? And those are policy issues. There are different ways that could be done, and it could be done in the most efficient manner. And these are things to be considered kind of going forward. But the takeaway from this is that the real reason we want more people working, and I'll be very blunt and honest about it, to pay more taxes, to help tamp down some of the deficits that we're experiencing, to reduce them in some manner, and to again, being very, very selfish here, to pay for Social Security benefits going forward. Okay, and that's a topic for another day, but there's some major issues in terms of Social Security kind of going forward. But anyway, I'm getting way off track. Point being again is that there's room for definite room for expansion so far as getting some great possibilities for getting more people out there engaged in that workforce. Okay, so switching gears entirely now, moving away from our three pillars or three legs of the stool of macroeconomics. When we talked before about economic growth and price level changes, inflation, disinflation, deflation, and about unemployment. Interest rates. Interest rates are something that we are all of us are very concerned about. This is a driver, not just for consumers, us as consumers in purchasing homes and cars and using credit cards and so on and so forth, but also businesses, of course, because businesses are, frankly, this is the way that you make money as a business, is by borrowing. Remember, the old expression of using other people's money comes to mind, but in order to operate a business in a most efficient manner, you are often borrowing more funds, and you need to borrow in order to expand business. This is just the nature of that business sector. It's what we call the deficit budget unit in economics, and that is that these are the folks that are borrowing in order to, again, to grow, to expand their business. Anyhow, so when we're talking about interest rates are a complicated matter to start with, okay, and we'll dig into it a little bit, just a touch. So to start with, let's look at when we talk about interest rates, we typically turn to the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Open Market Committee. They're the monetary policy making arm of the Fed, of the Federal Reserve. So it's part of the Fed. Actually, it's pretty much all the Fed, but there is a specific committee that actually makes those decisions within the framework of the Fed itself. But anyways, we won't go into that in any great detail. It's the Federal Reserve the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, or the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC. They meet every 6 weeks, and they are the ones that determine what the Fed funds rate is going to be. It would be the targeted Fed funds rate, and then there were actions taken in order to make that targeted Fed funds rate into the effective Fed funds rate. But again, I'm not going to get into any great detail on that but that's the body that's out there that drives interest rates, drives the Fed funds rate. When I say interest rates, that rate, that federal funds rate, it's a short overnight rate that banks borrow and lend, amongst themselves, if you will. So at any rate, going back to 2020, when we had pretty much zero interest, the Fed funds rate was pretty much at zero. It's popped up significantly, and just recently, so it stayed very, very high for quite a long time, and that was in response to the uptick in inflation. We had both demand pull inflation and we had cost push inflation as well. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the Fed that was their response to this rapid inflation that we saw again from the personal consumption expenditure index side of over 7%, which was terrifying, honestly. Back in 2022, it's come down quite a bit since, and the Fed's response to that was driving up rates, because if you drive up interest rates, people are less likely to do what? To borrow, to go out there and buy things on credit and exercise their credit that they do have. At any rate, this driving up the rates kind of limits that. Nonetheless, so now this is the counter response coming from the Fed or the FOMC, is that those rates have started to come down. And the latest, when it was over 5%, I think it was 5.5, it's down to 4.75 now at the end of November, and it's expected to probably drop another 25 basis points, or 0.25%, down to 4.5%, that upper limit of the Fed funds rate. But needless to say, one of the main drivers behind interest rates are Fed policy. Okay, we'll be getting. It's not the only thing. In fact, they have quite a limited amount of power, at least so far as trying to drive rates down. They do a darn good job of applying the brakes in the economy, in driving interest rates up, but they don't have as much power on the other side. Think about it as a string. This is what was taught to me a million years ago by my great econ instructors that I had. Fortunately, I've been able to hang on to a few of the tidbits that they passed along to me, and that was that the Fed policy is very, very effective in terms of stopping the economy. Think again about a string. Pulling on a string, you can immediately gets taut. But when you try to grow the economy, to get the economy back up and running, it's that string pushing back, doesn't do much, if at all, anything, right? Anyhow, that's onward we go. Okay, so moving on, when we talk about monetary policy, that is primarily we're looking at the Fed, at the Federal Reserve being responsible for that. And now kind of switching gears to another aspect of interest rates, and we're staying on this topic for quite a bit here. Uh, we're looking at the fiscal policy side. This is the legislative side. Think about it in terms of Congress and of course the executive, the president as well. But in particular, we're looking at on the congressional side so far as spending is concerned. And the the under what undergirds our financial system so far as on the debt side, the debt meaning the lending and so on and so forth, is that we focus on the U.S. Treasury, on our federal debt, on our overall federal debt, and you can break it down into public and et cetera. But the point is that looking at that big picture of the U.S. Treasury, and as I tell my students, I point out that the U.S. Treasury building in Washington, D.C. is one of the, well, they're all enormous. It's monumental size. It's unbelievably huge. And I ask them, so how much money is in the U.S. Treasury? And people, they don't know. So they just throw words out in the billions and so on and so forth. But I say, well, the reality is that they actually have a negative 36 in this case. The latest numbers are $36.1 trillion. You can look this up, the current debt to the penny, the U.S. Treasury, and you just Google that, and you can see where we're at for that given day. So we're currently at $36.1 trillion, meaning that we being the people of the United States, through this Treasury, this awesome building that should, that is huge, cavernous, etc., and all we have embedded inside the U.S. Treasury are IOU notes, in essence, right? The debt to the tune of 36.1 trillion. But looking at this in a more practical manner and without again getting into too much detail, the point is that this debt that we have, this is debt that has to, of course, we have to pay it back, right? And if we don't pay it back, we at least have to do what? We have to pay interest on that debt. And yes, we're having we have accumulated deficits. So the deficits are things that are added to the debt, or if we have a surplus, that would be reducing the debt. And we haven't had to worry about surpluses going back to about the year 2000 and prior, couple of years prior to that. And there's some discussion as to whether or not that was actually the case or not, but nonetheless, we accumulate deficits, and the accumulation of those deficits result in an increase in our debt, and we're at $36.1 trillion. And that debt itself is broken up into various what are called treasury securities, okay? And they're broken up into what are called bills, notes, and bonds. So treasury bills, treasury notes, and the long bond, the treasury bond of 30 years. So bills go out to a year, meaning, very, very short term, relatively speaking, not interest, but maturities going out to about a year. So you have a 60-day, 90-day, and so on and so forth out to a year for the bills, and the notes go from 1 year out to 20 years. And what that means is that the Treasury, we, the people, are borrowing money to, we'll say, a 10-year note for a period of 10 years, and we pay interest on that accordingly, whatever the market rate is. And it's important to understand that this is Treasury offerings are auction based, right? So these are auctions out there in the marketplace where people are buying these, they're buying these debt instruments. They're securing loans. The other side rather, they're lending, if you will, to the U.S. government and to the agreed upon terms. The agreed upon terms are arrived at through auctions. Terms, of course, being what the interest rate is going to be, for example, specifically, I should say. At any rate, that's kind of like the backstory. So that $36.1 trillion includes all of those bills, notes, and bonds. And remember, this is this is constantly moving. And since we are not doing we're not paying it all off, they have to be re-upped all the time. So have to go out there and issue new bonds to make up for the other bonds that are expiring, right? If they're as they mature. So that was a quick little snippet on the U.S. Treasury. What's going on with our $36.1 trillion. So when we break this down, like the actual ownership of these treasury instruments, of these treasury securities, those bills, notes, those aforementioned bills, notes, and bonds, people are often concerned about other people owning our debt, meaning foreigners, and this is drilling down on it a bit, and as of now, I mean, this is pretty late. This is, I think it's this year, so it would have probably been for this quarter, meaning for at the end of the third quarter. I don't have the date on the report. This is coming from the Fed itself. The Fed as being the Federal Reserve, right? Not and it's again through the Treasury and so on and so forth. But foreigners hold about a third of our debt. A large portion of this debt is actually being held by the Fed itself, the Federal Reserve, and it's broken up into other, holders, if you will, of those U.S. Treasuries. So when we say that, is there concern about foreigners holding on to holding on to our debt or having our debt? Yeah, of course, there is some concern. Not so much that they're actually holding on to the debt, but that they're being paid interest on that debt. But again, just wanted to kind of show you somewhat of the breakdown. So the largest holders are, and it's not reflected here as much as it should be. There's another piece of this, and a lot of this is held by federal agencies, such as, yes, Social Security Trust Fund, right? They have, I think, on the order of about $2.5 trillion, which is a sizable portion. So that's above and beyond what we're looking at here. We're just looking at the debt that's being held by outside of government, and there's quite a bit of debt that's held within government, different government agencies, but meaning at the federal level. Nonetheless, it's interesting to see that the numbers have gone down a bit on the foreign side, and also the Fed itself has been shedding some of its treasury holdings as well. And that's for another day of discussion, but as to why the Fed is holding on to U.S. Treasuries, again, this is one of the main reasons that they participate is that, in buying, and I'm air quotes here again, buying U.S. Treasury securities is to kind of prop up demand and to drive down the price of those, drive down the interest rates that are out there. So this is part and parcel of their monetary policy. And again, I'll stop here, but just to kind of give you a quick look at this. This is who actually owns these U.S. Treasury securities. So again, drilling down just on the foreign ownership, the foreign holders of the U.S. Treasury securities, the numbers have actually come down quite a bit for China. China's kind of backed off a bit. They were typically 1 and 2 with Japan. Japan is pretty steady, about a little over $1 trillion worth, and China has again in the latest numbers. $772 billion, and that was from September of 2024. So this is ownership of U.S. Treasury securities. So this is what they own. This is what we owe them. And there are various reasons why it is that this would primarily, I'm thinking that this is this is government ownership, but it's actually it probably would include private as well. Not so much from China, since there really isn't, I don't know that they can actually, other Chinese citizens can actually buy U.S. Treasury securities. But the takeaway from this is that there's a rationale, there's a reason why Japan and China and why these other countries are holding on to U.S. Treasury securities. And the reason being is that a couple of reasons, and there's more to it than this, but just real briefly, U.S. Treasury securities are considered an extremely safe bet. They're considered no risk. And the reason they're considered no risk is because as a country, we have never failed to pay the interest on our debt. Going back to Game of Thrones, and this is old time for a lot of you guys already, but like the Lannisters, they've always paid their debts. We, as a country, have always paid our debts. That is not the case for most other countries in the world. In fact, probably 90% of the countries in the world at some point in time have kind of welched on that debt for a variety of reasons, payments of interest on that debt. So it's a safety reason. And the other reason is that it has to do more with the currency exchange rates and trying to prop up other currencies. And I won't get into any other detail on that right now. That's for another time. But nonetheless, it's something just to kind of keep in mind. There are some reasons for these. So the note of concern about the U.S.'s position so far as like being, the U.S. Treasury securities, that outstanding our federal debt, being a concern going forward is that how stable is that really, especially in light of what? Especially in light of the our ever expanding debt, or the rapidity of our expanding debt, of the deficits, the persistent deficits we've been experiencing. Anyway, that's for the next topic here. So moving on now, you get to look at my face again. Sorry about this. So we're looking at now we're talking drilling down on more of this fiscal policy. We talk about federal budget deficits, and the impact on the debt, of course, is that when you have a deficit, that adds to the debt. It increases the size of the debt, the amount of debt that's out there. So I suspect over the course of the next, we'll just say 5 years, we will definitely be north of that $40 trillion, unless something changes in the meantime. But this is also a concern. This is a considerable concern, again, going forward, because this is where you start to look at that U.S. Treasury debt as being, the increasing size of that being more of a concern in the world markets in particular, not just world markets, but also within our own country, since most of the debt that's out there, 2/3 or more, is actually being held within our domestic economy in the U.S. So again, the point being is that you start to concern yourself with our ability to pay our debts and so on and so forth. And the reality is that because of again, looking back again on this left-hand side, the budget deficits, these persistent budget deficits, it made sense for the fiscal year 2020, again, October 1, 2019 through September 2020. The way that they determine the fiscal year is the amount of the calendar year that is the largest portion becomes the fiscal year. So the fiscal year 2020, 9 months of 2020, so that becomes the fiscal year 2020. That's just a little anecdote I'll throw out there to you. And why we have fiscal years different than the annual years so far as the federal government is concerned is because their inabilities, this will be a surprise to you, to reach budget decisions. So they've pushed these numbers back and to the point where we're at now. But at any rate, that's beside the point. We've had persistent, consistent deficits. So during COVID made sense, 3.1 trillion, huge numbers, and helicoptering money into the economy, as we've mentioned before. 2021 fiscal year also pretty darn close to that $3 trillion. Then it dropped down to 1.4 trillion. Then it popped back up to 1.7, and our latest numbers, again, rising to 1.8 trillion. And the real question is that why would we continue to run these deficits to this extent when we're, which one of the downsides to this is that we're also doing what? We're experiencing with this continued deficit spending that's pumping more money, if you will, into the economy. All right. This is money. This is fungible in terms of, we're borrowing more and we're pumping more funds out through government expenditures. And this is a note of concern. In addition to that, what you'll notice on the right-hand side is that when we talk about the average interest rate on that debt, is rising as well. So it's risen considerably, going from, again, in the year, where are we at? 2015, we were at about 2.35%. Then we dropped down to, I think at one point we were below 2%, the overall interest on the debt that we'll be paying, the weighted average, the total amount of interest, the average interest on the debt. And now it's rising back up to 3.32%, and that will continue to rise, especially in light of the fact that we have higher interest that, so far as the Fed funds is concerned from the monetary policy side, but also interest rates are driven not just by Fed policy. That's a very important point to make, because remember back what I said about if they wanted interest rates to come down, trying to juice the economy, to get the economy back up and running, the Fed has very, very limited power. So we'll see interest rates continuing to drop on the Fed side, but it may not be reflected in the overall interest rates that are out there, in particular when we talk about the U.S. Treasury securities, those bills, notes, and bonds that constitute that overall debt. And so the note of caution, or the thing to kind of keep in mind, is that this is something I've been paying attention to for quite a bit, is that rising interest payments on the debt. We've reached the point where we've crossed over the $1 trillion mark so far as paying interest on our debt, and it's become the largest portion of our annual budget is interest payments on debt. So lots of ground here that has to be kind of discussed, but we won't talk about it right now. But suffice to say that we will have rising interest. So we've got two problems. Continuing deficits driving up the debt, overall debt, the amount of debt that's outstanding, and in conjunction with that, another downside would be that interest rates will continue to rise as well into the foreseeable future. Perhaps not as rapid as we've seen over the course of the last couple of years here, but they will be rising nonetheless, because that debt that we have going forward has to be re-upped, if you will. It has to be, as those bills, notes, and bonds mature, we have to reissue them, because we're not paying, the debt is not coming down, it's going up. More to follow. So this is another quick one, a note of concern, and that is that when we talk about the relationship between the gross domestic product, or how quickly our economy is expanding, growing, in relation to the amount of debt that we have outstanding. So we were below 100%, meaning that our the debt to GDP was the overall debt was lower than our GDP, our gross domestic product. This is an important thing, but it's maybe not as important as other things, but it's something important to note, that the last time that we had higher than our debt, higher than our GDP, our actual economic growth, goes back to World War II. So wartime conditions, when things are really crazy, it makes some sense. Other countries operate differently, and we won't go there, but this is definitely a note of concern for us when we have our debt again at 36.1 trillion, significantly higher at this point than our GDP. This is nominal GDP. This is our inflated dollars, but nonetheless, the point being that with our GDP at, say, I think it's about 28 million, listen to me, 28 trillion at this point, our current debt being at 36 trillion, we're moving in the wrong direction. Although it did come down a bit, that relationship, it would be ideal, or at least something that, so if past is kind of what we're trying to get back to, which would probably be advisable, hopefully, that ratio where our economy is growing faster than or at least at the same rate as as our debt. Just again, just a quick one on. So again, when we talk about deficits and so on and so forth, we're seeing, increased deficits. So remember, going down is bad in this case. This is increased deficits, increased deficit spending. So we saw as a result of the COVID and the gray bar that you see, that is indicative of a recession, which of course we had because of what happened with COVID. It's what we call exogenous, in terms of something that happened from the outside that was beyond our control entirely, which again was what happened, as a result of COVID. Nonetheless, it did go back up, meaning it reduced our deficit, but now we're trending back down again, and the pressures on deficits kind of going forward are just a couple of things to be concerned with, or to be aware of, I guess you might say. Maybe three, with the increased issues in terms of military, that might impact our spending. Increased spending on military because of all the issues around the world, whether we're talking about the Middle East, or we're talking about issues with our adversaries, or at least our global adversaries that are out there, would include China, Russia, North Korea, the list goes on. But anyways, you get the idea, is that would probably prompt us to do what? To spend more on military. So the other two items to consider are, one would be that debt that we talked about. The rising interest payments on the debt, that is something to definitely be concerned with. And also when I mentioned before about Social Security. While we have a trust fund out there of about 2.5 trillion, I believe at this point, that number will be coming down. And what I mean by that is that we will be asking the Treasury to start releasing funds as we go. We start to draw out more than we're kind of pumping in terms of contributions. Benefits will exceed contributions, so they have to go to the Treasury to say, hey, Treasury, we need $500 billion this year, $250 billion this year. So what does the Treasury do? They write a check for $250 billion, and then they have to turn around and do what? To refill that hole that's out there and borrow an additional $250 billion. So this is something that's going to be impacting budgets going forward. Three things at least, right? We're talking about, again, about military spending. We're talking about interest payments on the debt that are rising. And we're also talking about the pressures on the social insurance side, if you will, not insurance, but social spending side, especially in terms of Social Security. So these are things to kind of be aware of going forward. So another note of caution regarding this, our $36 trillion in debt, is that what is something called the weighted average maturity of the outstanding debt, and that's about 6 years, 71 months. The good news is that's relatively long term. The bad news is that over the course of the next 3 years, we'll get to that on the next slide, but we do have to roll this debt over, because yes, we are not doing what? We're not going to drive down that debt. Well, at least in our current mindset, we are not doing that. We're not running surpluses, and if we run a surplus, that will reduce our overall debt. But currently we are running deficits, and because of the aforementioned reasons that we already talked about, chances are that debt is going to continue to rise. Hopefully at a lower rate, and we can discuss how it is we get to that in another, maybe in another discussion, or perhaps in this one going forward. I never know where I'm going to wander off the tracks, but nonetheless, we do have, there's about a 6-year weighted average maturity of outstanding debt. So between our, going from 1 month out to 30 years of our debt instruments that are out there, the average maturity of that debt is about 6 years. So with that debt that we're talking about, that again, that 6-year average weighted average maturity, we're looking at over the course of the next 3 years that we're going to have to refinance 54%. And again, we're talking the point of concern at this point is how about that? The point of concern now is that when we refinance that debt, it's going to be at a higher interest rate. So if it's going to be at a higher interest rate, that means that we're going to be doing what? Paying more in interest payments going forward. So probably moving from the 1 trillion, I'm just guessing at this point, from our annual interest payments of $1 trillion coming out of our current budgets. Remember that. It's going to probably move up to 1.25 trillion or 1 trillion 250 billion or 1.5 billion, or could go higher than that. I suspect that it will, because of what the higher interest rates for one, but also the accumulated deficit, continuing to accumulate deficits going forward. Very, very concerning, right? Always kind of keep these things in mind. There's a lot of things going on, but this is another one to throw in there, is that we have to continue to refinance this debt that we have. So now that I bombarded you with interest rates, so we talked about the macro portion of the economy in terms of starting with economic growth, with GDP, et cetera, and then moving on to employment or unemployment, and then we covered the various aspects of inflation, and with the PPI, the CPI, and the personal consumption expenditures, and then we delved into interest rates a bit. And remember, there's much more to it than that. But that's just, we touched upon it. So the last thing I want to talk about is touching upon trade, and specifically to start with, that'll be very, very brief here with tariffs. So again, I'll just read some of this. So the conventional wisdom dictates that consumers bear the brunt of tariffs. But is this always the case? Yeah. So in general, when people talk tariffs, and 99.9% of economists will come out and say tariffs bad, in terms of the consumer, because the consumer is going to be the cost of those tariffs. The tariffs are a tax, right, on imported goods, and that would be passed on to the consumer. And the rationale behind tariffs, there are a lot of different reasons for it, but the outcomes of tariffs, the things that people are scared of oftentimes with tariffs, are that, at least so far as the domestic economy is concerned, is that tariff goes into place that is going to drive up the cost of the domestically produced items as well, because the incoming goods, the incoming imports, are going to be priced higher, and that's going to allow some wiggle room for domestic producers to do what? To raise prices. It will give them an out, give them an option to raise prices, which is something that is always in the mind of all producers, of all firms, is that the higher prices, generally speaking, when they get away with it, result in more revenues, and it's all about increasing revenues, right? Increasing that bottom line, those profits that kind of stem forth from that. But at any rate, so that's kind of like the downside to tariffs. There's some reasons, some rational reasons for tariffs, such as national defense. You don't want our adversaries to be producing our boots for our military, for example. Being the only suppliers of boots for our military. There are some others in terms of such arguments as like infant industry, where you want to protect your own home industry to build it up, etc. Lots of other reasons behind that, that kind of go along with it. But in general, people are pretty much opposed to tariffs. Having said that, there's more to the picture than kind of meets the eye. So what happened, these are kind of recent things that have kind of come down the pipe, and that is their pike, I guess it is. One has to do with Canadian soft timber. This is a friend of mine kind of talked to me about this quite a bit. He's in the lumber industry, and again, you have to be cautious of in my backyard type of a scenario. You have to look at the overall big picture. And granted, this is anecdotal, but it kind of rings true. And that is that Canadian timber, soft timber in this case, like pine, etc. Um, there was the Canadian timber was priced very low, and what I mean by that is that due to perhaps subsidies on the Canadian side, allowed them to ship to sell Canadian timber at a lower price in the U.S. Below market price. How about that? And you say, how can it be below market price? This is a term for dumping, where you're selling it below what the market price would normally be otherwise. Okay, so there was that aspect of it, and that's something that was addressed, or it was addressed by uh, through government, the federal government, in terms of putting tariffs in place so that to offset those subsidies that were being given to the Canadians on their domestic side, right? The domestic producers, and then the exporting the product. Similar to that, China has made major strides in trying to become they're monopolist at art in terms of like steel production, aluminum production, and iron ore production, and bauxite production. That the core materials, if you will, that are the components that go into the production of steel, the iron ore, the production of aluminum, the bauxite. And there's a lot that goes along with this, but the point being is that that they were selling at far below that would be what would be considered, again, putting quotes out here, market prices. So tariffs were put in place to offset that, and because the aim of the Chinese in particular are, they want world domination so far as production of a lot of these materials, steel, aluminum. And the argument, of course, on the Chinese side is, no, we're doing this for our own infrastructure, which is, there's some truth to that. So don't get me wrong. It's, building up their own infrastructure using a lot of those materials for their own infrastructure. But nonetheless, their pricing on the world market is considerably lower. And there are a variety of reasons behind that, or there are a variety of components that are, if you will, behind that. But nonetheless, this is the rationale for the tariffs kind of being brought into place. In some ways, it's kind of a blunt instrument where you're taking a hammer to something that might require some other techniques, some other a scalpel rather than a hammer. But at any rate, that's kind of the rationale behind tariffs. So they're not. I don't think that they're entirely misplaced. And so always keep in mind that. So the bottom line is that we said before about the consumers bearing the brunt of these tariffs. The reality was that with the Canadians and with the Chinese in that case, with the steel, the reality was that, so we'll just take a Chinese exporter exporting steel. So there's a tariff placed on their steel to the tune of $100 a ton, whatever the number is. We'll throw it out there. Rather than passing those higher costs onto the consumer on the U.S. side, what the Chinese opted to do, for the most part, instead, was to eat it themselves, so that they could remain competitive. And you're going to ask, how could they do that? And they could do that because there was such a large profit margin on their end. And we're going to get into that in a little bit when we start talking about foreign exchange in the final part of this segment, which again will be very brief. But the takeaway from this is that it's not necessarily the case that the costs are passed on to the consumer. In this case, we're talking about the domestic consumer in the U.S. Okay, so keep that in mind. That tariffs sometimes can be very effective, and they can be useful, and they can be appropriate. Okay, is it the best tool to employ? I don't think so, but it's something that's within the toolbox that's out there that can and should be employed in the event that other choices are not available. So again, I'm going to be very, very brief here because I'm going kind of way further than I had ever anticipated. But when we talk about trade, trade involves two prices. So think about it this way. So you are the exporting country. So you are producing, in this case, we're talking about China. You're producing goods for export in China. So you've got your cost for your productive resources, for your labor, entrepreneurship, capital, land, and then you're going to be selling your product. Domestically, you turn around and sell it, or if you're going to be selling it to some other country as an export, correct? You're going to be selling it to the U.S. in this case. So you're going to be selling it to the U.S. and you're going to be doing what? Selling it in terms of dollars. So the point is that, excuse me, the Chinese have a long, long history of fixing their exchange rates. So they have a fixed exchange rate, and they're not alone. Others say that they don't, but there are many others that do have, in essence, these. They might have a semi-float, if you will, but they're in essence they're fixed exchange rates as well. The rationale behind a fixed exchange rate is that if you're an exporting country, and there's a lot of reasons behind why China has become an export-driven country, at least in regards to the U.S. and most of the G20, if you will. There's a rationale behind that, but we won't go there. Point being is that leading up to this is in the Wayback Machine, going back to the 1980s, the Chinese yuan or the renminbi, I always have a hard time with that, the Chinese yuan or renminbi, or it's CNY, we'll just say for short, the Chinese yuan, was at about, we'll just say at 2 to 1 in the mid 1980s. So 2 Chinese yuan to $1. And the Chinese, think about it in terms of Tiananmen Square in 1989 and so on and so forth. And what was the driver behind Tiananmen Square? It was because of unrest in China. Particularly, we're talking about students who couldn't find employment because of the push away from, long story short, push away from an agrarian economy, pushing people into cities and became they were educated and so on and so forth, but they did not have jobs. And that was one of the main reasons, if you will, behind all those, the uprising, if you will, that resulted in the Tiananmen Square. And we can all see this image of a man standing in front of a tank in the middle of this in my gigantic Tiananmen Square, largest square in the world, I believe it is, in Beijing. And that is the image, again, if you will, of Tiananmen Square. And the reason behind Tiananmen Square was people didn't have jobs. So what did the Chinese do? They said, well, we can start an export economy so that we can put these people to work. And they'd already been doing this, but it became at a much more rapid pace. And the easy way to do this, or probably you could say the easy way to do this is by depreciating your currency or devaluing your currency, more correctly speaking. So the yuan went from about 2 to 1 up to about 8 to 1, meaning that something that it's 8 to 1 to the dollar, 8 yuan to the dollar. And currently it's at about 7 yuan to a dollar, and it's been kind of bouncing around within a relatively narrow band for a number of years. And this is where the second price comes into play. So the first price is paying your own people, and then the second part of it is the translation from your goods being, whatever the cost is for you to whatever the exchange rate is going to net in terms of on the next piece of on the journey and actually selling those products abroad, in this case in the U.S. So the Chinese had a tremendous advantage, first to start with, in terms of the cost of labor and so on and so forth in China, but that has significantly been changed, altered over the years because of increased labor cost in China, honestly. Increased increased prosperity in China has resulted in driving up wages significantly and so on and so forth, and other costs as well. When you factor in such things as transportation cost, it becomes a major, major component. And so those costs have risen significantly, and it's kind of eroded some of those profits. Nonetheless, there's still a significant advantage when you're talking about moving from 2 to 1, even though it's 40 years ago, to the current 7 to 1. In terms of 7 Chinese yuan to a dollar, that's a significant advantage. And again, it's not just China, but this is just an example. So there's a lot that's involved with this. So rather than drive prices up for, to offset those tariffs, the Chinese instead opted, for the most part, to eat the cost on their end, to take less profit, if you will. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of things that are going on in the future. But remember, it always takes two. It takes two to tango, and it takes two. So the U.S. can, looking forward, can change some of this dynamic in terms of foreign exchange with a depreciating dollar, rather than having this dollar that, at least in terms of the Chinese yuan, is quite overvalued in my estimation. Anyway, there are ways that could be dealt with that way, but at the moment we're looking more at it in terms of tariffs, and that's just and in spite of it saying it's not a policy, it is nonetheless. There is some policy behind it as to the rationale why it's being employed. So that's it, folks. We're done. There's a lot here, and it's well over an hour, so I do apologize for that. But nonetheless, I've been very, very late in getting anything out, so hopefully this makes some sense, and I haven't stepped on my too far in terms of making mistakes here along the way. But hopefully this does make some sense. Thank you.